JuliaMUsher, Recipes for a Sweet Life. As you may know if you follow me on Instagram or Facebook, when I work on projects for my video shoots, I often post my work in process. Not very glamorous photos, but they're there to give you a glimpse into my design process. Well, when I was doing the folk art flowers and leaves for my folk art bird nest project, I got tons of questions about how they were made. So I decided that I would also make a separate video altogether describing these beautiful flowers. They're actually all constructed of pieced together royal icing transfers with the exception of the vines, which is a swirl of rolled fondant. But the petal leaves, the centers of the flowers, and the leaves themselves are all royal icing transfers. And while they look obviously super cute on my bird's nest, they are also infinitely adaptable. You can change out colors and shapes of the petals and leaves and make them for any array of projects. They make great cupcake toppers, great cake decorations. So let's talk about what we'll need for this project. But before we do that, I just want to show you a close-up view of those flowers. Pretty spectacular, and you can see how dimensional they are. That's a function of them having been pieced together from the individual transfers. If I were to pipe those completely flat, they'd never look that way. You can see they have a lot of lift to them. Similarly, on these vines, lots of dimension to the leaves and how they stick out from the vine, and that's because those leaves are all separate little transfers, as are the dots, which are supposed to mimic little buds here in folk art land. To make all of those, you'll need not too many things. You're going to need some templates for the leaves. I just printed these out from some clip art I found online, and I'll have the links to the clip art in my video description. I printed them out to various sizes because it's always a nice idea to have some variation in anything in a project. So I want some of the leaves to be small to tuck into nice little corners, others to be a little bit bigger to really stand out. Then you'll need some cardboard and some acetate, which is actually this thin plastic, to create kind of a piping template. So what I do is I take that template on paper, cut it into smaller, more manageable sections, slip it onto some support cardboard, and then tape the acetate over it. So we'll be piping directly on the acetate. You could pipe royal icing directly on parchment paper too, but it tends to curl and buckle more as the icing dries, so I prefer to work on acetate typically. It takes a lot longer to dry on acetate because it doesn't breathe as much as parchment paper, so just be aware of that. You might need to give it a couple days of drying time as opposed to overnight in order to lift these off, but all of that drying time depends on the size of the transfer. So you'll need a leaf transfer and template and setup, and likewise for the flowers you'll want to do the same. Again, I had printed out some clip art flowers. This is going to create a larger flower with 3 lobes to each petal. I've created a similar kind of acetate set up for actually piping. And then I've got some smaller flowers with just a simple lobe, a single lobe to each petal that will do as well. Again, I want to have range in the size of flowers just as I do in the leaves. Now for the assembly process, the leaves will go on the vine in a pretty straightforward way. I'll take some green fondant, shape it into a rope, a tapered rope if you will, and then literally stick the dried leaves into it with a little bit of icing glue. The flowers are a little more complicated to put together because you need to support those petals so they don't flop down. And for that, I'm going to use little wire rings. This is nothing more than wire I got from the hardware store, and shaped it into different size rings for the different size flowers. So we'll use a smaller ring about 1 inch across to support the petals on the small flower when we put it together. And of course, we'll need a host of different icings of different consistencies to pipe the petals and leaves. But let's move forward, starting first with the leaves, then the flowers, and then we'll put everything together on a vine. So onto the leaves. I'm going to show you how to set up the template. I covered it briefly. So I've got the printed template that I mentioned. I've got a cardboard just for support. I do like to break the template down into something more manageable because when piping, it's hard to have a lot on one big page and to get in and overhead it to see how you're actually piping. So the less I have on a piece, the better. So I often use small cake rounds for the support, put my template there, and then stick my acetate on top. And I already talked about the virtues of using acetate over parchment, but either will work fine. I just want to cut that down to about the proper size and just make sure it's super clean because anything on the acetate will be picked up in the piping of the icing. And then we just want to tape that in place so that the ideally tape the acetate to the paper template, to the cardboard, so all three items are taped together so nothing moves as you're piping. I'm going to tape in a little bit to make sure I make contact with that paper and keep that acetate really, really flat. And that's all there is to it. That'll be our piping surface. I've got one already made for the smaller petals, a medium-sized one, and a smaller one. And I'll just show you basically how I created this very simple folk art shape consisting of nothing more than a line and a dot. And it's all a wet on wet technique, meaning I'm going to be piping icing wet onto wet icing and then letting it dry. None of these details are piped later. So my first step is to trace the leaf using a dark green icing of outlining consistency that holds a nice tight shape. Then I'm going to come back in and flood the interior with a looser, thick flooding consistency icing that will settle nicely into a flat shape with a little bit of a mound. It's a little tough to get into that tight corner, so I'm going to use my trussing needle to kind of tease the icing all the way into the point of the leaf. And now I'm applying the brown icing on top. This is an outlining consistency as well, but this is a wet on wet technique because I want that line to settle into the green icing underneath. So I'm piping it directly onto the green icing without allowing for any drying time. Same thing with the green dot, and just tapping out any peak. And I only want to do one leaf at a time because if I do too many and I wait too long, then the brown and the dark green won't settle into the light green underneath. Okay, onto the flowers. They're piped much the same way, just with a different template underneath them. I'm working with 5 colors here as opposed to the 3 I had in the last one. I've got a thick flooding consistency orange and a pink for the bulk of the inside of the petal. I've got a rich eggplant color and an outlining consistency for the outline of the petal, and then a turquoise thick flooding consistency to provide an accent inside the petal, and then lastly a cobalt blue, which will form the dot with another color for the center of the flower. For the dots, I'll be using a simple template that looks like this with lines drawn parallel to one another that determine the diameter of the dot. I don't trace each individual dot because the icing I'm using is a beadwork consistency and it will naturally go round without me having to trace a round shape. I just need these as guidelines to know roughly how big I want those dots. Then moving on to the template for the large flower, here it is already constructed. And again, just as a reminder, got a small cake cardboard. I'm sticking my printed paper tracing guide underneath and my bit of acetate on top and just taping all 3 together. I like to work on one big flower like this at a time and simply rotate the disc as I go. As you'll see, I have maximum control that way because I can get around the whole flower without having to reach over into something much bigger. So we've got big size and a medium size, and then lastly our small flower template. So I'm going to start with the center dots based out of cobalt blue and pick up one of the other colors on the inside of the petal, either an orange or a pink, and that cobalt blue will not be used in the petal, so it'll really set itself off when I put that center into the flower later. So I want a nice round shape, and for that I need icing of beadwork consistency. I'm only doing a few at a time because again, this is a wet on wet technique and I don't want that blue to set up before I apply the orange and then the pink. The pink and orange are the same consistency. I want it relatively loose to settle into the blue bead underneath. Now let's move on to a petal of a large flower. I start with an outlining consistency again. This is a dark eggplant color. I want that outline to hold its shape nicely, and then come in with a flooding consistency in a light eggplant color. Again, only doing a couple at a time because I don't want that eggplant to set up before I apply the blue dots. I'm using my trussing needle to marble the blue dots and then laying the eggplant color down between the blue dots to create more definition on the petals. That looks great. Now moving on to the small flower and the small petals. Same process, but simpler. Again, outlining with dark eggplant, flooding with orange this time, and then immediately wet on wet applying the blue dot. I'm not going to marble the blue dot this time. The piece is so small that it won't really show well, so I'm just going to put a simple blue dot towards the center of the petals. And of course, you'd want to complete that all the way around and do a full set of petals for every flower. Okay, we've got all of our petals and leaves completely dry, ready to pop off the acetate and ready to assemble. I'm going to start with one of the big flowers. And as I said earlier, it needs a little wire ring to support it, otherwise the petals will flop over as I'm gluing it together. So I've created one about 1.25 inches. I'll have the exact dimensions in the video description for the larger flower. So I'm going to start with a little blob of fondant in the center to which I'm going to attach the tips of the petals. And I don't want to glue the fondant to my cardboard because then it might be really hard to get this off later without breaking the flower. So I'm just going to stick it while it's damp onto the cardboard, and that'll make it a lot easier to get it off later. So I'm using fondant to insert the petals into as opposed to a lot of thick royal icing because it's less likely to smush out when I insert the petals into it and be less visible. Also, the petals stand more upright in it more quickly than if I were to stick it into thick royal icing. But I do need a little bit of icing to secure the petals to the fondant, and that's what I'm putting down here. Just a touch of thick royal icing glue on the fondant and then inserting the tip of the petal into it. And I'm using blue fondant here because I'm planning to use a blue center, and so if any of that fondant should peek out in the final construction, it'll be less visible because it'll meld in well with that blue center. Again, attaching the blue center now with a little bit of thick royal icing glue and just dropping that center in place. And you can see how nicely that wire ring keeps those petals lifted off the cardboard, so they'll have more dimension once it's dry. As far as drying time, typically I give that a few hours, if not overnight, before removing the ring. Same process with the small flower, a little bit of fondant in the middle and then some icing to secure the tips of the petals to it. Taking care to get those petals as close together as possible to hide as much of the blue fondant underneath. And just dropping that center into place. And again, we'll let that dry for about the same amount of time before we move the ring. Ta-da! Okay, you can use the flowers alone on a project, or you can insert them or attach them to a vine as I did on my folk art bird's nest cookie, and that's what I'm going to do here. To make the vine, I'm simply rolling dark green fondant into a taper, rolling directly on the work surface, and I want to give it a nice whimsical curl at the end. Just don't handle the fondant too aggressively when you do this because you don't want to flatten the vine. You want to maintain its nice rounded shape. I also don't want the vine sitting in one plane, so I'm going to give it a little lift at the end by inserting some paper towel underneath. Eventually it'll dry into place with a nice curve at the end. But we don't want it to dry too long at this point because we still need to insert those leaves and flowers, and the fondant needs to be pliable in order to do that. Right now the fondant serving as a nesting place for these pieces I'm attaching, much the way it did when I put the flowers together with the blue fondant. So everything needs to be pliable while I do this, the fondant does. Of course, the royal icing pieces need to be fully set up in order to handle them. And I'm just attaching them with a little bit of thick royal icing glue using a color that matches the color of the vine, so if any peeks out in the final construction, it'll be less likely to show. I generally start by anchoring my biggest pieces towards the bottom, the flowers and the big leaves, moving up to more delicate pieces as we get to the top of the vine so that the overall vine doesn't look too top-heavy. Now, in inserting the leaves, you don't want to press too hard again on the fondant, just a gentle touch, because if you press too hard, you'll flatten the vine, and we want that vine to stay nice and rounded. That needs a little more glue to keep it in place, so I'm just going to add a little bit more and stick in a tiny petal, or leaf I should say here, and then one last leaf up at the top. At this point, I'm not too concerned about the green icing showing on the front of the leaves, as some does, because I'm going to come back in and hide it with some of the buds, those little round pieces that we made earlier. They were made on purpose to disguise those seams, in fact. And again, that's just a simple gluing process, putting down a bit of thick royal icing glue and dropping the bead or dot in place. I'm starting with blue and pink ones, and then I'll come back with some smaller blue and orange ones to even out the color palette along the length of the vine. I've got a large concentration of orange now at the bottom in the flower, and I want to make sure I get some orange accents running all the way up the vine. So onto those orange beads, as I mentioned, and that all looks great. At this point, if green icing is peeking out, you do want to clean it off so it doesn't dry in a visible part on the final construction. Okay, so I've got that last bead where I want it. That looks really lovely. I like it because not all the dots are going in the same direction. The leaves are also going at different angles to one another, so it looks really fun and whimsical. But to note, I haven't decorated the back side of these. If you want to do that, that's perfectly all right. You won't be able to plunge the leaves into the fondant after it's dried, however. You'll just be able to stick them directly onto the dried fondant. And I would do that by laying this on bubble wrap or a tuft of paper towel so you don't damage the top side when you're decorating it. But I'm going to leave these one-dimensional for now. I think that's adequate. They're really charming as they are. Just a note on drying time, that's a function of the fondant you use. I'm working with satin ice. It dries relatively quickly, but even so, I give these a few days to a week of solid drying time before I can really pick them up and handle them and plunge them into other projects. Till next video, live sweetly.